So, marking Teachers' Day in Korea, today's K-Culture Issues segment explores the stories of mentors and protégés within the Korean film industry. Across both academic institutions and real-world production sets, Korean cinema has long fostered a culture in which generations of filmmakers and actors continue to influence and inspire one another. And who better to discuss this with us than filmmaker and Seoul Institute of the Arts Professor Jae Soh, a teacher and mentor himself, of course. Welcome back, Professor Soh.
Hello, Professor.
Nice to be back.
And happy Teachers' Day. I see you also have a carnation there with you.
Yes.
All right, so before we go into our main topic today, let's talk about a recent event, the Baeksang Arts Awards, which took place last week. So how did you see this event, and also especially how did you see the winners in the film category?
Right. It's a 62nd Arts Awards, and basically you can imagine it to be sort of the Oscars, the Tony, and basically the Emmy. So it goes through film, theater, and television all at once. And the big winner was King's Warden's actor Yoo Hae-jin, who won for Best Actor, but the Best Director category went to director Park Chan-wook. And so there's a movie called No Other Choice that he made. So, and what's interesting about it is there are many different films of different genres that were competing. And in the past, it's been more sort of traditional, like a big budget film that had won. But this year, for the Best Director, Yoon Ga-eun won for the World of Love, which is like an indie film. So what I found kind of interesting about this year's sort of the film part of the awards is that it was very sort of like it had a very spectrum of different kinds of films, sort of more personal films versus films like, The King's Warden, which was kind of a big budget historical drama. So other festivals basically always go after sort of the mainstream, but I think this year, not only for, film, but for theater and television as well, they were also sort of like marking out new filmmakers and sort of, I guess, theater directors that were making their mark, for the first time.
Right.
Yeah.
I also quickly want to mention we also had Tanjong, the king, receiving some awards, right?
Right. So this was not the Best Actor award, but Neighbor had Best Newcomer, and it won that award for Park Ji-yoon for King's Warden. And King's Warden actually won this thing called the Gucci Impact Award, which is sort of like a special award that I guess Gucci was sort of sponsoring for. So, it got its due. So I think director Cha Han-jun's lucky that he's not only a bestseller director, but he's also now a award-winning director as well.
Right.
Right. Now let's move on to our main topic, the kind of student-teacher relationship in cinema, like as an example. Could you introduce some, let's say, mentor and mentee relationships in Korean cinema that have significantly changed or shaped each of the growth?
Sure. There's so many, actually, because the relationship between mentee and mentor in Korean cinema is a very close relationship. One relationship I can sort of talk about is Park Chan-wook's relationship with director Lee Kyung-mi. So they actually met at this film festival called the Misangsyeon Festival, where the directors come in as judges, and she had a short film called The Feel Good Movie, and basically she won the grand prize, and so he was introduced to her, and then she worked for him as an assistant director and scripter for a movie called Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, which is like a really great Park Chan-wook film. And then afterwards, she made a movie called Crush and Blush, which was her debut film, which started. So what's interesting about the mentor-mentee situation is that basically a director will take somebody under their wing, really teach them the ropes. But what's interesting about Korean cinema's sort of that relationship is that the mentee doesn't necessarily copy the master, but basically, goes off on her own sort of style. And so, Lee Kyung-mi's another director, I would say, in the vein of Park Chan-wook in the way that she has a distinct style. If you look any of her films, like Truth Beneath, like movies like that, it has a style all on its own. So that's similar in that way, but I think what you learn as a mentee and a mentor system is you learn the professionalism of working basically behind a camera on a professional set. So these are a relationship that's gone on for a very long time in Korean cinema, and it continues till today.
Right, and you earlier mentioned 어쩔 수가 없다 or No Other Choice, and if I'm correct, I guess director Lee Kyung-mi also helped in that script as well for Park Chan-wook.
So they're collaborators now, which is interesting.
So just like we see in these cases, it looks like on-set experience culture is very important in Korean cinema. cinema. Please tell us why.
Well, the Korean sort of movie, if you go back, to, I would say about 10, 15, to 20 years ago, we had a system in Korean cinema which was the assistant, director, system. So in the West, assistant directors are somebody that's more of a professional level sort of position. But in Korea, the way it worked was if you wanted to become a director, you worked as an assistant director, and basically I worked in that system too. It works like you're first, second, and third, and each has a different thing. I started as a third assistant director, but basically when you become the first assistant director, that's like basically the last step before you become a director. So it takes about 10 years. It's a system that really worked as an apprentice system where you learn the ropes, you learn from sort of the masters, you get to know the crew, things like that. But nowadays, Korean cinema is now sort of more similar to the West in the sense that, a lot of directors like, we're going to talk about Naongjin, but like he just straight out of film school started directing movies. But so now the assistant director position is a professional system. That's not a stepping stone towards becoming a thing. But this kind of like, we talk about mentee, mentor, but the apprentice system worked for almost every division, not just directing, but for cinematography, for art direction, for sound. But now that's kind of changing. The landscape's changing because of, I would say, the biggest thing is streaming. Yeah.
I see. Now, Korea is home to many renowned film and acting schools, and relationships formed between like professors, students, seniors, and juniors, as you definitely would know, Professor, often continue into the professional film industry. Now, how do you think these connections influence Korean cinema, and what might be the advantages or even disadvantages of this?
I have firsthand knowledge of this because I actually, when I made my first film, I used students both in front of the camera and behind the camera. So, a school like Seoul Institute of the Arts, like we're basically a filmmaking school. It's not like, learn theory about filmmaking. We do a little bit of theory, but you're actually there making films. But when I debuted my feature, I had people as an assistant director in the camera department. I had professional crew members, but we had students in every part. And I'm really proud that I used some student actors as well. And I think that's the sort of the professional level of a relationship that actually crosses over into professional, I guess the world of filmmaking and the film industry because, there's an actor named Park Jong-hwan that was played a small part in my movie. My movie's about student filmmaking, and he played a zombie. And basically, he's now a professional actor that comes out in movies, and he won like an award for a movie that he did a couple years ago. So these kinds of relationships really work because it's again going back to the mentor-mentee system, but we're now in an educational sort of setting where basically a lot of professors do have inroads to industry connections. So even if the director is not a professor, he can actually connect the students to other directors and things like that. I'm always asked by directors, and not just on movies, but on OTT platforms, who the next big actor is going to be. So I'm always kind of looking amongst my students to see what the next big star is, and I have some ex-students now that are really famous actors, which I'm very proud of.
So interesting to hear of those hands-on experience, Professor Soh. And since you are directly teaching students, do you see these students also kind of follow some creative lineages or some role models?
Well, I think right now, we're going through a change because as Korean cinema is, as you know, the theater system isn't really doing that well. And I think right now, the new wave of sort of filmmakers coming up, I think they're much more keen to sort of mixing genres, creating new things. They're really influenced by TikTok and YouTube, that generation. So I'm hoping that besides the traditional way of sort of looking at the masters in film and sort of following their lineage, I think this new wave of filmmakers are going to really influence the way the cinema is going to look, the type of stories they're going to tell. And I think right now, I'm hoping, even though the theaters aren't doing that well, that this new wave of, sort of filmmakers are going to be much more in touch with the zeitgeist of the mainstream audiences. So we talk about that a lot with my students. It's like, how will you speak to your audience and who your audience is? And I know, I'm a different generation, so, I think they're going to be speaking sort of to the younger crowd and the people sort of their generation. So I think this kind of influence in sort of, I guess, tradition versus what's new is constantly being renewed. Yeah.
I see.
An interesting thing has been happening recently with international students wanting to come to Korea to study film and acting. So, what do you believe are the defining strengths of or characteristics of the Korean film education?
Well, Korean cinema, because of, I think it started with K-pop, K-drama, and finally when, Parasite won the Oscar with, Bong Joon-ho's film, it really sort of revitalized the Korean film industry. And right now, even at my department, I have students from Europe, Spain, Vietnam, Japan, China, Russia. And I always ask these students, like, they have to speak Korean, because they're going to a Korean university. But I said, well, why are you here? And they said, well, the best filmmaking is being done in Korea. They really want to be a part of that. And I think what's interesting is they're coming in sort of looking at us as sort of the benchmarking sort of country for that. And it's interesting because I studied filmmaking not in Korea, but in Hollywood, basically in LA. So to me, my style of filmmaking is, I would say, the way I teach it is like basically Korean cinema plus what's happening around the world. So it's very international. And I think, we've done exchanges with other countries like America, Vietnam. And what's kind of interesting is that, besides the language barrier, what really brings us together is filmmaking itself is a very international language. So it doesn't matter where you're making the film. As long as you have the ability to have a professional crew to do something, if you have something to say, I think now the world cinema is becoming at a certain high level. And Korea is definitely sort of a beacon for that right now.
And speaking of that global interest in Korean films growing, currently we are also seeing a big interest at the Cannes Film Festival, which is underway, especially with director Na Hong-jin's Hope going to be screened there soon. So what are your expectations for this film, and what does this mean for Korea's cinema in the broader sense?
This movie is sort of like an interesting movie between sort of what's happening in Korea politically, because it's set in a town that's near the DMZ, so it's dealing with South and North Korea things, and it's got an international cast. So it has Hwang Jung-min as the main actor with Cho In-sung, but at the same time we have Michael Fassbender, Alicia Vikander, an international cast. So I think what Na Hong-jin's film has been very much, his films have been, I think all four of them went to Cannes before, and he's had sort of a darling of the festival. And this time he has had sort of like a big film. It's like 160 minutes, sci-fi set in a small village in Korea. It's garnering a lot of interest, and it's really tight-lipped. I think there's like a very short scene on the internet if you want to look at it. So I don't even know what the movie's about specifically, except what's on there. But it looks really exciting because Na Hong-jin's kind of a director that his themes are very dark. The Wailing was the last film he did, and he made a horror film after that. But basically, I'm really looking forward to this film. And then the magic factor is, director Park Chan-wook is the jury president of Cannes. Hopefully, maybe he can influence the results. I don't really know.
He said it doesn't. It won't influence him that there are Korean movies there.
You have to say that. But at the same time, I think Na Hong-jin is a director, that sort of like is making sort of like a new kind of film. And this movie has, I heard there's creatures in it as well. So really blends something that what he's done traditionally in the genre of like crime, dark thrillers into something that's sci-fi and fantasy. So I'm really looking forward to this film, and I hope it has good results at Cannes.
Let's cross our fingers for that. And Professor Soh, thank you very much for always educating and informing us on Korean movies and everything. And happy Teacher's Day again.
Happy Teacher's Day.
Thank you. Happy Teacher's Day.
Thank you. And thank you, Walter. As always, we're going to have you back here next week.
See you next week.